Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Schutram. If you have any questions after this, you want to email me. My net ID is BS773. I can also post that in the chat so you guys have it, but feel free to email me afterwards. I am a third-year PhD student in Claudia Fischbach's lab. In our lab, we study the tumor microenvironment with an emphasis on breast cancer. So actually, Garrett and I are both in the same lab, and we study breast cancer and obesity and develop tissue culture model systems so that we're able to study that more accurately in vitro. And if you want to take over now, Garrett, or
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. We can do Fishbach back to back. So I'm Garrett Beagley. I'm a second-year PhD student, also in Claudia's lab. And as Brittany mentioned, our lab is really interested in looking at sort of what's known as the tumor microenvironment. So like the analogy we always use is if you think of cancer as being like, as cancer cells as being like seeds, we study the soil that they grow in. So sort of the different tissue that are permissive or restrictive to cancer growth. And I'm also sort of on the half of the lab that looks at the link between obesity and breast cancer, but the other half of our lab looks at breast cancer metastasis to the bone.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So hi, I'm Catherine Driscoll. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Butcher Lab, and I'm studying calcific aortic valve disease, and we use tissue-engineered 3D models to study the interplay between different cell types and how they're signaling to each other to induce a transdifferentiation of certain cells in the valve that causes them to become bone-like. And when this happens, that's when the valve starts to calcify. So we use 3D gels to study these interactions, and then we also put these gels into larger bioreactors so that we can induce cyclic stretch, which is something that's physiologically present in your heart valve.
Cool, and maybe just to go back and touch a little bit more on the tissue engineering aspects of our lab. We also have a lot of tissue engineered model systems to study breast cancer. So we have a lot of work. Some people in our lab work with microfluidic devices to create models. We do a lot of like collagen gels, making hydrogels. And then I think one of the kind of cool parts of our lab is we also work with clinicians down at Weill Cornell in the city. And so we're able to get patient tissue samples sent to us that we can isolate different cells from and then incorporate them into these tissue engineered models. And so that's something that Brittany and I both work with in Claudia's lab.
I like to say also there's kind of three thrusts of our lab. One of them is more embryonic mechanistic work, but we also have another section of our lab that is solely focused on tissue engineering of heart valves for replacement. So this is a little bit more of a clinically translative project, whereas mine is more using tissue engineering to develop model systems for like relevant studies of calcific aortic valve disease.
I guess, does anyone have questions necessarily, or does anyone want to introduce themselves specifically related to tissue engineering opportunities at Cornell, or just about research in general?
Was most of your undergrad research experience also related to tissue engineering?
In my case, it was. My undergrad experience was related to tissue engineering. I was also sort of in the same field of doing models of the tumor microenvironment. But I can also let Catherine and Brittany field that question. I don't think it's necessary to have been in tissue engineering if you want to do tissue engineering in your PhD, though.
yeah. So at least, I guess. Catherine's still big. Okay. So at least in my experience, when I was an undergrad, I worked in more of a pure biomaterials lab. We did a little So we worked on, developing hydrogels and trying to culture salivary gland cells for more of salivary tissue engineering. So we focused a little bit more on maybe the chemical aspects of it. But we have people, that come into our lab. A lot of people are from, they do BME as undergrads, but there are people that also come in from a material science background or biology or things like that. So it's definitely not necessary to have the exact skill set that you probably need. I mean, we are all learning new techniques anyways. And I think it's actually very valuable to come in with a different background. So there's that.
Yeah, so I did do tissue engineering research, but I also did research that was completely unrelated in undergrad. So my first really big research experience was actually at a pharmaceutical company where I had a chemical engineering position. That was like working more with creams, ointments, gels, developing dermatology products, which is like completely opposite of tissue engineering. And then I worked for, I think, a year and a half in a lab on campus, and there I did get a little more experience with like cell culture and like kind of some of the basics of tissue engineering. So I would say like definitely my experiences with tissue engineering helped me in my graduate research, but also some of the things that I took away from my chemical engineering internship, I used some aspects of that in my work too. So I think no matter what research experience you have, like there's a lot of diverse problems that you'll have to solve in your research, and so like you can pull from those different skill sets depending on, yeah, I guess what you're doing.
How do you guys choose a project in your lab? Do you choose based on other people's previous work, or is your original idea?
At least in my case, it was, I guess, Claudia let us have a decent amount of flexibility. I definitely started working on some experiments and some lines of reasoning that other people in the lab had previously worked on, or things that were naturally interested in just based on previous results. But I think at least in my case, Claudia was open to me sort of guiding the direction of the research based on what I was personally interested in. Brittany or Catherine, I don't know if you can share. We also have questions coming in on the chat if you guys see them.
So I have kind of a unique experience because I switched labs recently. So my first project that I worked on was completely my idea. So I would say that PIs are definitely open to it if it's something that still is going to fall into like their field or like their scope, because like they don't want you to work on something that you won't really have the resources or expertise around you to be able to do it. So I would say like any random thing you think of, like they're not going to say yes, but if it's like reasonable and like in that area, they'll probably say yes. But I would say now what I'm working on is a little bit more, is like a continuation of someone else's work. And I think honestly, having both of those experiences, for me, it's preferable to start with a continuation of a work that's already been somewhat built up, because it gives you a good baseline where you can start and you can practice techniques and have something to compare against to make sure that like your technique is right and you're doing it right. And then from there, you can start like building off into your own branch in that field of study.
Yeah, I agree with Catherine. I think that's kind of the approach that Claudia has with us, is that when you first start out, at least for the first couple of months, to do some shadowing and try and repeat experiments that other people have done just to make sure that you get the techniques down. And then you start to move and, develop your own techniques and your own experiments. So yeah, I see we're getting some questions in the chat like Garrett mentioned, so I guess we can just start from the top. So someone asked, how do we end up choosing our labs? So basically, I guess you guys all probably know by now, when you join Cornell, you're not committed to a certain lab. You basically get, the first couple of months to try out a bunch of different labs, which I'm sure you have also heard about maybe. How I kind of approached it is there were, 3 labs that I was interested in. I was interested in Claudia's lab, and then Larry Benasser's lab, and then I also talked to Yadon Wayne about his lab. Basically, I ended up choosing Claudia. I liked her mentoring style the most. I think that we connected just on a personal level. I also really liked the work the lab was doing. I was really interested in moving into this cancer space, so that was an added plus, and I felt like I fit in with everyone in the labs, like socially fit in really well. At least for me, I think that, you know, projects and labs are very flexible, and like I'm working on something now that I, you know, was not even involved in my first year and wasn't even proposed as a project that I could do. So in my opinion, if you're, you know, picking a lab, as long as you're interested in, you know, the general area of the study of the lab, I ended up choosing more based on PI than project specific things. Just because after, you know, meeting with Claudia and, you know, going through the rotation process in her lab, I just felt like we fit together the most. So that's how I ended up picking.
So I guess I'll go next. The way I picked my first year was kind of similar things in terms of like who my lab mates are going to be in the lab culture. But I will say that I definitely picked the lab based on the project at first, like my first year, and I think that that wasn't the wisest choice because I came to realize later that the mentorship style that I was getting from my PI wasn't really the best for me. I wanted someone who's a little more hands-on and offered a little more guidance. And so then I ended up switching into a lab of someone, my committee member, and someone that I had been rotating before that is like meets with their students a little more regularly and is a little more hands-on and kind of has a different style. And I would say like definitely like what Brittany said, like choose something in the general area of what you think you might want to work on. But I think finding a PI who is a good fit for you is like very, very key.
I guess, and then just a slightly different perspective. I knew coming in that I really wanted to work for Claudia, and so I think one nice thing about Cornell's program is you do have sort of flexibility in your first semester to rotate with, you know, as many labs as you want to, or in my case, I like had Skyped with Claudia a lot before coming, and I had done tumor microenvironment research in the past, and I felt like I had a good rapport with her, and so I pretty much started right away in Claudia's lab. So it's kind of nice that you have flexibility where if you do really know that you want to work for a lab and they're looking for a position, that you could just start right away. So it's kind of up to you.
Okay, I guess we can move on to the next question we have typed in here. That's okay. Okay, so this one I guess is Claudia specific. So what's it like working for her? I guess Garrett and I can kind of comment on this. I think that Claudia is really great at kind of adapting her mentoring style to what you personally need. So I'm someone that, you know, I really like talking over my ideas. I really like, you know, designing my experiments and then saying like, hey, what do you think about this? These are the options I'm considering. You know, like what setup do you think is going to work best? So I think she's really good about being flexible. And if you want that kind of support, you can get that. I know when I first started, you know, she had especially offered too that if I wanted to, we can meet on a more frequent basis, which was great for me. I think she's really supportive. You know, everything, it's always very constructive that comes from her. And, you know, she, I think, is also really respectful of having some sort of work-life balance. So I think she's great in that regard too. So yeah, I don't know if Garrett, you want to add a little bit more?
There we go. Yeah, I agree. I felt like Claudia was a really good fit for me as well, and sort of her advising style. The way it works in our lab, at least, is that we have weekly lab meeting once a week, and then we meet with her individually once a month, and then we have subgroup meetings based on topic also once a month. So we either have those subgroup or those individual meetings every 2 weeks. So for me, at least, it was a good balance of sort of being, you know, not too hands-on, that I still have some freedom, but also still providing, you know, Claudia's very available to provide guidance if I want it ever. And yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed working in Claudia's lab, and I couldn't recommend her as a guy enough. But again, you know, everyone has their preferred internship style and different things that they're looking for. So.
Okay, so next, our summer rotation at Weill Cornell. So I will say my summer rotation was awesome. I was paired with a cardiothoracic surgeon, and I got to see a ton of procedures. He basically kind of treated me like a med student in that he would like go over like the charts in the morning with me and then like quiz me, and then like he was very engaged, very open to teaching. And then we also did a clinical research project together that ended up getting accepted at a conference in Toronto. And me and my immersion mentor actually went up there, I think last May, together to this like big surgeons conference. And there were all these biomaterial vendors there with like prosthetic valve replacements and stuff like that, and it was really cool. So I would say it was a great experience for me as far as like what I got out of it on the clinical side, and I also had a ton of fun in New York City.
So Garrett and I had very similar experiences. We had the same clinical mentor. So we both worked with a reconstructive plastic surgeon. So this was really interesting. I mean, he was, you know, super involved in having us. So we got to go to clinics. So we got to see, you know, people that came up for, you know, preoperative clinic meetings, and we got to see them post-op. We also got to see them during surgeries. The cool thing about, you know, working with the plastic surgeon and their team is we got to the variety of surgeries we got to see. So we saw, you know, reconstructions after head and neck surgery. We got to see, the coolest thing that I got to see is when they took, it was a fibular flap. So they took the fibula, they have like 3D cutting guides. They basically cut that bone. So they take it from the bottom of your leg, and they're able to fit it into the jaw to reconstruct and create a whole new jaw. So it was really interesting. It was way more than just watching people get boob jobs. So it was awesome in that respect. And also their lab, you know, Garrett and I continued to collaborate with them to this day. So I was down there, also got to do some research. We would get, you know, breast tissue straight from the OR, and we were able to get the cells that we want from that, ship them back up to Ithaca. So it was a really great experience for me too.
Yeah, I think Brittany covered most of it. If you end up coming to Cornell, cannot recommend Dr. Spector enough as an immersion mentor. I think, you know, in our case, he was a plastic surgeon and we're a cancer lab, so it wasn't necessarily like a direct match in terms of research interest. But I would 100% do it with him again, because he was so dedicated to making sure that we had a good experience and really making sure that we were able to observe surgeries and participate into everything's going on in the hospital. And ultimately, that's the point of the program, is to give you clinical exposure. So I think that's more important than working with a clinician that's like dead on a match for your research interest. And like Brittany said, now we still get human tissue from some of the surgeries he does, and isolate cells from them and use them experimentally. So. Belinda, I don't think you're muted.
Guys. Sorry, guys.
And then, oh, Catherine, did you want to address the next question, or?
Yeah, sure. So the next question is, how much of what you do, technique, skills, tools, etc., in the lab, did you know how to do or have experience with prior to working in the lab? So Yeah, so like in the first lab I joined, I was working on ECM work, and that requires a method called decellularization. And I had never done that before. I hadn't even really thought about it too much before. And so that in itself was like a completely new type of technique that I had to learn. And basically, a big part of that research is like having the technique and being able to get the cells out and keep the matrix. So I'd say that was definitely something new that I learned. But I also have had experience with like cell culture before I joined the lab, making collagen gels, and then also like a lot of chemical experience. Um, and then now that I've switched labs, I switched from cardiovascular research to cardiovascular research. So I would say a lot of the skills that I gained in my first lab, I've kind of moved to my lab now. But it is a slightly different body system for valves. So a lot of like the disease mechanisms are things that I've had to learn since. Um,
I mean, I guess in my case, I was coming from a lab that also did tissue engineered models of the tumor microenvironment. So I happen to know quite a bit of the skills and techniques I was already at least somewhat familiar with coming into the lab. But, I think one thing you'll learn if you don't already know this from working in multiple labs is even like a similar protocol, labs can do very differently. So, there's definitely still a process of just sort of getting oriented with the lab and how the lab did everything, and just getting sort of up to speed. And, there are, techniques that Claudia's lab does that I wasn't familiar with, that I was able to pick up as well, so.
I'm going to move on to the next question. And if anyone else has any more, you can ask them at the end. I know we're starting to run out of time. Okay, so this last one is, our collaborations in our lab focus more within tissue engineering field, or are they spread out over the department? I would say in the case of our lab, we have both. So our lab, especially the bone subgroup, they're very involved with labs in the Department of Material Science. So they do a lot of materials characterization. So they'll do things like SEM or more, Raman imaging, elemental analysis of the composition of their materials, things like X-ray diffraction, all of those things. So we're definitely involved in that. We have a lot of collaborations with imaging labs, both in the department and out of the department. So we use a lot of advanced imaging techniques. So we work really closely with the Biotechnology Resource Center, which is in the basement of Weil Hall. So we work a lot with the imaging folks. And then, we're also doing collaborations in our department. Specifically, we have one going on right now with the Devlamic lab. We're doing a lot of single cell sequencing and things like that. So we definitely, collaborate all over. Also work with some labs in the vet school. So we have far reaches.
So I will